let's go ahead and we're going to talk about training adaptation. And really what we're going to be getting into is kind of the cellular signaling that's going to get us the effects we're looking for. So, think back to the SAID principle, think back to obviously a little bit what we talk about in exercise physiology with specificity of your body is going to get better at the demands you placed upon it. You do this by obviously applying a stimulus. This stimulus is some type of stress on some type of tissues. And from there, those tissues are then going to go ahead and remodel. So that's giving us essentially our initial stimulus. We then try to adapt and then we get our full response. So if we're looking at our true performance as the blue line, after we do some type of stimulative training, our performance can be a little bit lower. That's because of fatigue. And fatigue is going to dissipate far faster than that increase in fitness. So then we apply our next stimulus. Hopefully we're at the top here before we're going to go and regress back to where we started and so on and so forth. So go figure, how we train is going to inform how our body is going to increase in performance with time. Now, the way this works is through signaling pathways. So training itself is going to give a signal to the muscle, which in turn is going to eventually end in our DNA is going to transcribe into messenger RNA, which will then translate into the proteins of interest. Yes, Tinks, I neglect you all the time. My cat's life is pain. Anyone that tells her otherwise is wrong. So what we have there is, if you guys look at the bottom of the screen, is the kitty that is so happy to be there, and she's now on the floor, where we have the initial training stimulus in the bottom. From there, we get that intracellular signaling. This is going to take a couple minutes, a couple hours. From there, we're going to have the body's response. So mitochondrial biogenesis, increase in mitochondrial number. Protein synthesis is talking about building more enzymes, building more sarcomeres. Angiogenesis is going to be building more vasculature. From there, after those days of those changes, over days into weeks, we've increased the number of capillaries we have. We've increased our mitochondrial density, specifically we're talking aerobic performance. And that is going to give us those physiological changes that we talk about, the things we're looking for. And then when we're talking about going from the weeks and then finally to months, now we have considerably increased performance, meaning we've done significant increases. So what we're really going to do is apply a stimulus that once again is going to give us this literal gene therapy. So we're going to activate these genes, which in turn is going to give us the proteins that we're looking for or help with the body in controlling the rate of which proteins break down. That's the degradation. So we might have less catabolism in the cell, which is good, or we might have more turnover, which can be good on occasion as well for cellular housekeeping, cleaning up anything that might be damaged inside of the cell. And then from there, we are going to obviously be regulating what's going on as far as is the cell going to be dividing, proliferating. Fusion is what we're going to be getting when we talk about the satellite cells for muscle that's going to help allow it to regenerate and perform even on a higher level. So now, as far as exercise-related signals, stretch and tension inside of or on the muscle cell is going to cause this, as is higher levels of intracellular calcium. Now, when we talk about energy charge of the cell, this is going to be relating to calcium, but also just we've had it depolarize a lot. So we're talking about sodium, potassium cycling. And then notice, guys, changes in the redox potential, meaning as we're producing more and more free radicals, they are in turn going to signal for the cell to start to put up some type of response to what's occurred. So this is occurring through what is known as a signal cascade. So those initial sensual signals that we've done in the cell, the damage that we've had it go through, in turn is going to cause activation of different proteins. This activation in turn, if we're talking about, you see how the resistance training, so we're talking about pathways that involve the mechanistic target of rapamycin, mTOR. It is in turn going to cause activation proteins that are going to build more muscle. Whereas if we're doing a lot of physical activity, we're going to be looking at AMPK or AMP kinase, which is it essentially is measuring the energy system or the energy levels inside of the cell, as well as we're going to have activation of PGC1 alpha, which itself is going to be a major protein that is literally going to tell the mitochondria to turn over and increase its number. So stress activates proteins. These proteins activate other proteins until eventually we literally activate and change the way that our own genetics are being expressed. That in turn is going to now give us those proteins we look for, and ta-da, adaptation. So secondary signals, this is where we're looking at essentially how we're getting the signaling going forward. So for example, when we talk about energy levels inside of the cell, so not just exercise, but the amount of nutrients we have available. That's why when we talk about the train low carb, high fat diet can be useful, because we're going to be turning over energy at a different rate and not have as much availability of things like glycogen. Now, this in turn is going to activate these proteins, which all are going to influence AMPK. Now, when AMPK is lower, we are being activated. We're not going to be synthesizing as much glycogen. We're going to be breaking down food stuffs for energy inside of the cell and increasing our mitochondria. Notice also, we're going to be blunting our muscle hypertrophy response. And that's part of the crossover interference effect, where effectively you're not going to get as great of gains if you're doing a lot of aerobic training while you're doing resistance training. You're still going to get the vast majority of them. Now, over here, we have that resistance training signaling. So notice we've got growth factors and hormones. So that's going to be things like growth hormone, insulin, testosterone, et cetera. Amino acids, specifically leucine, arginine to a lesser extent, but really it's going to be leucine, because it's actually going to be leucine on the tRNA that's in turn going to signal on mTOR. Also, leucine increases insulin production. And IGF-1, that's insulin-like growth factor, so muscle growth factor, and mechanical signaling, aka we've done the work, hence resistance training. Now, that's the insulin receptor substrate, which in turn is going to phosphorylate phosphoinositol 3 kinase, which in turn is going to activate eventually AKT, which is also known as protein kinase B, which in turn is going to inhibit tumor sclerotic factor 1 and 2, which in turn is going to allow mTOR to effectively not just be phosphorylated, but it's also going to get into the Raptor, not Richter configuration, which in turn is going to phosphorylate P70 S6 kinase along with 4-BP1, which is also going to affect RB6, which in turn is going to cause increased DNA translation. Meanwhile, AKT, as it's going to be stopping FOXO, which is going to also influence the MERF box, which in turn is going to help us avoid breaking down more protein. I have a PhD in this. You don't need to remember those things. That's a lot. Instead, there's no such thing as magic when it comes to human physiology. There are signals that are produced, which in turn are going to allow our body to have a response. Now, negative regulators, this is going to be constant inflammation, myostatin, and notice endurance exercise. That's going to be working against us. Another big component here is straight up nutrition. If we don't get in enough protein, enough macronutrients, we're not going to be able to really optimize, much less even get mediocre responses to resistance training when it comes to building muscle. It's just the way the body is. Does that make sense to you guys? Awesome. So, same image as before, but now what we have here, guys, is notice different triggers. So we've got substrate, metabolism, and then we also have muscle contraction. Reactive oxidative species, remember that's going to happen from aerobic metabolism, mechanical, it's stress, and then total calcium turnover. Now, what we're going to find is, and then mechanosensation, so that's effectively part of having a stretch and otherwise. Those are going to be factors which in turn are going to influence protein building and protein breakdown. So hence the FOXO and the MERF box being influenced so that it's not as active in turn is going to help us avoid having so much protein degradation. Whereas obviously when FAK, focal adherence kinase, which is a protein that effectively is making sure that everything on the cellular membrane is like it should be, which hence why it gets banged up from doing training. Junk, ERK 1 and 2, those are going to be obviously related a little bit to energy turnover as well as those mechanical stressors. We notice PGC1 alpha. Now you've got sirtuins, more the FOXO. All of these are going to in turn give us different types of increases in transcriptional and translational processes inside of the cell. Now, a lot of stuff going on here. Altered reactive oxidative state, that's because notice we're going to have not as much NADH We're going to be getting more into that. Should be NAD plus. That's a spelling error. I get many that they've done when this text was kind of fun, as well as when we have lower amounts of ATP available inside of the cell, as well as lower glycogen levels. All of those are going to give us that signaling that we're effectively going to be getting towards. We need to do something so the body's going to still allow those individual fibers to recover. Now, remember, guys, it's not just the muscle that we're using, it's the fibers inside of those muscles. So we have to do enough work in order to get them to be activated. Now, when we're thinking about the time course, guys, that primary signal, that's going to be the training itself. So we're really talking about, we kick it up in really only probably less than a minute. That in turn is going to activate the signaling cascade, which is going to activate the translation, which is going to give us the protein synthesis. Protein folding takes a decent amount of time. It's not a super quick thing. And like anything else, it's going to be limited by the physics of how quickly it occurs. I'll see if I can find a video to show you guys at the end to see how quickly proteins are made. It's actually really neat. Now, go figure, nutrition is going to help affect this. If we happen to do training where we are effectively getting in lower amounts of carbohydrates, you can see how since we've got that energy depleted state in the first place, we're going to naturally signal for more mitochondria in the cell and get better at aerobic metabolism. Now, this is a good thing because it turns out we in turn are going to have a greater propensity to maintain aerobic metabolism. Now, when you get to the point where you're going to compete, that's when we want to increase carbohydrate intake. So that way we're going to be able to maximize performance, and because we've got the greater glycogen stores to work with. Now, a couple different things are going to influence, obviously, how our body's going to effectively respond to training. Now, training without breakfast, because you typically have lower muscle or lower liver glycogen when you wake up, can give you a little bit of an advantageous effect, because it turns out now your body is going to effectively be having to use more fatty acids purposefully as a fuel source, which in turn is going to give us more of that train low effect. Giving ourselves carbohydrates during exercise is going to help increase not just performance then, but it's going to also help decrease the general stress response. So if we're really looking to try to have an effect on training, we should actually probably try to minimize or limit the amount effectively that we're having going on there. Now, leucine is going to be important for increasing the potential for that muscle synthesis, but having the other signals of doing the training and otherwise is very important. Now, antioxidants, actually supplementation of things like vitamin C, E, and A as means to help decrease the total amount of reactive oxidative species we produce, actually has been shown to be more detrimental because we don't increase our endogenous production. And once again, it's the signaling molecule itself. And the same thing is going to be said of people that are using a lot of NSAIDs. So we're taking a lot of ibuprofen. Otherwise, it's actually going to blunt training adaptations to a little bit. So yet another reason to avoid painkillers. Now, what we have here is the effects of what's known as VEGF, which is a vascular factor, which in turn is going to help increase the amount of capillaries and blood flow we have to those areas. And turns out it's going to be another signaling pathway that's important, specifically when it comes to aerobic performance. Now, when we're talking about the train low mechanisms, notice, guys, how not just AMPK, but MAPK are going to, in those lower amount, be more active. Now, when they're more active, in turn, it's going to have that more robust response to increasing cellular enzyme levels. Now, like anything else, yes, this can help a little bit acutely, but as far as doing it all the time, it's probably not a great point. It's something to do more or less in the off season. And notice, guys, since this type of training is harder, recovery is going to take a longer period of time. So we're going to potentially risk giving an athlete too much stress. We do find, yes, and we're going to talk about immunosuppression whenever we happen to be doing large volumes of training or high intensity, and specifically long steady state. So this is something that we might try to use a little bit, but this is potentially something to use seldom. And we should probably try to do it more in the off season, because when we get more into the in season, we're trying to optimize, we're trying to figure out our carbohydrate strategy. So we're going to have the best possible performance given what we're asking our athletes to do. Now, overtraining itself is going to be something that unfortunately occurs when someone has done way too much stress. We talked about this in XPhys. It happens to be slightly related to, well, just simply applying stress before your body can resolve it. And then this is where folks say, we're going to train max, we're going to out-train anybody. Like, that's cool. You can always put yourself through more pain than is necessary. That's not a great strategy. What we're looking to do is optimal training. And so when we're talking about overreaching, which might be a brief period where we give even extra volume of work to folks, we're going to see muscle glycogen depletion, which means it's more stressful in the first place. But if we give somebody a good taper, decreased volume, we're going to find an improvement. Now, glutamine is a worthless supplement when it comes to sports performance. However, it might have some usefulness when it comes to the immune system and helping folks avoid getting sick, but it's not something that's going to be ergogenic and increasing performance. BCA is the same thing. You're just doing flavored water. They're not really going to give you much as far as increasing performance, but I guess they taste good, so that's useful. Now, when it comes to those symptomology, and I know we talk about this in XPhys with overreaching and overtraining, the key thing is they're not interested in it. They're going to be essentially not feeling good. They're going to not be performing as well. Their sleep can be messed up. You're going to have mood aberrations. And then this is where we increase not just the risk of illness, but also increase the risk of injury, because we're going to find that they can't perform as well as they could previously. Their body is simply in state of constant under recovery where we're driving them down. So as soon as the athletes aren't as interested in being there, they're just kind of acting a little bit more like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. That's when it's like, okay, we need to go ahead and back this down, because this is where you risk potentially getting into type 2 overtraining. And when we've done that, congratulations, you've now done so much damage to your athlete, they're never going to get back to the previous levels and bests. We've essentially, each of your tissues has a certain recovery capacity. And if we outrun it by too big of a margin, we're not only not going to be able to get back to the level we were previously, or much less gain forward progress, but we might have done enough detrimental damage that we're not able to move forward ever again. So what can we do to help with decreasing this? Well, it turns out usually a higher carbohydrate intake is going to be useful in these type situations, especially if we're doing a lot of volume of work and we're doing this from an aerobic component. But the biggest key when avoiding overreaching and overtraining, it's not optimizing the diet, it's just not applying too much stress in the first place. So we want to make sure that when we're working with our athletes, we're applying a realistic amount of training volume and never asking too much of them. And yes, we can always go higher carb, especially if they're doing a lot of glycolytic work, both aerobic and anaerobic. So that way they're going to have that level of performance and high enough level of performance that we're looking for. So I touched on this briefly before. We want to produce a certain amount of free radicals thanks to training, which in turn is going to give us the signal for adaptation. If we go ahead and supplement with a lot of antioxidants, we don't get the same amount of free radicals. And if we don't get the same amount of free radicals, we in turn are not going to be able to get those performance changes. Now, when we talk about the reactive oxidative species, this is going to be things like hydrogen peroxide, okay, the stuff that people use to essentially clean wounds on occasion, as well as a superoxide molecule, so really resembling oxygen with an extra electron, as well as hydroxyl radicals, so that'll have a negative charge as well. So it's just binding to things it doesn't belong on, which just does damage. It'll break down proteins, do damage to proteins, and then they have to be completely scrapped and rebuilt. But that signaling in effect is going to help increase performance. Now, go figure, nutrition is also going to be important when it comes to sleep. So with an athlete, if they're not sleeping as well, aside from potentially giving issues with the both mental effects, recovery effects, and immune effects, what we're going to see is then folks can potentially be making less than optimal decisions nutritionally. This is where we can maybe have issues with essentially over snacking and otherwise. Now, when you're doing a lot of training volume, it's normal for folks to have issues with not essentially sleeping as well as they have before. That's a good indicator that you're probably stressing yourself very well, or if you're not able to sleep as deeply. Now, if you're getting full-fledged insomnia and otherwise, that's not going to help you too much, but we can kind of help this out a little bit if we help focus on a couple nutritional strategies. So first and foremost, if you're going to try and help yourself essentially go to sleep, we don't want to do too big of a meal, because like anything else, you're going to have issues with just the digestion part of it. But doing things like high GI carbs that are relatively simple, that can effectively help a little bit with promoting sleep. But like anything else, if we do a giant bolus before we go to bed, we're going to potentially feel a little uncomfortable. Now, higher protein actually seems to have the same positive effect when it comes to sleep quality. However, higher fat, specifically pre-bed, this seems to not help in the same area. Now, if we're not going to be taking in as many calories in general, it can be much harder for folks to go ahead and sleep. Whenever I would do far more aggressive cutting diets for competitions, I would find that I would call it my starvation energy, because I would have a hard time getting to sleep and staying asleep, because essentially my body's in a stress state and it's losing weight and it doesn't want to. So it's like we need to find these calories somehow. Now, you can even supplement with the individual amino acid tryptophan as well as glycine. Glycine's been shown to be slightly sedative in effect because it works against glutamine. Tryptophan, because it happens to be actually a precursor for 5-HTP, which then is converted into the joys of serotonin. Now, you can do this by obviously just putting down essentially a little over half a pound of turkey, which, that's not the worst type of pre-bed dinner, but I don't know how many people are quite into that. Now, melatonin itself is going to be obviously something you see folks supplement with. It's usually in the neck of 1 to 5 milligrams. Men tend to tolerate it not as well as women. So women, you can see as high as like a 10 milligram. Guys, you might feel a little hungover if you try to do something like that. We can also even do supplementation with things like not just valerian. You can try things like lemon balm. Chamomile tea is something that's obviously popular, and magnesium supplementation. Now, we talked about magnesium before. The isoforms are important. Some of them is just going to essentially just give you diarrhea, oxide, magnesium oxide. Now, obviously, I know Cass has had interest in this when we've been going through this class, which is how can effectively we utilize nutrition as a means to help us recover from injury. And it turns out, like anything else, we are going to have the same type of demands like we're working with a normal strength power athlete. In fact, the highest protein demands you'll ever see in an athlete or in an individual is burn victims, because they have a certain amount of weeping wounds every day that is going to cause loss of albumin, which is protein, as well as they're trying to remodel skin, and skin is lean mass. So like anything else, if we're trying to come back from injury, we want to make sure that we're getting in more than enough protein, dosing it at multiple, relatively even intervals throughout the day in order to help allow for optimal recovery. Now, like anything else, we need to keep in mind where certain minerals, vitamins, if we're not getting enough of them, that's going to also have a negative effect on our body's ability to recover. Now, specifically, we're talking about just having enough of all of our essential amino acids. Getting in omega-3 fatty acids is important for nervous system recovery, as well as also for being anti-inflammation. That's going to be DHA and EPA respectively. Polyphenols, just an important component that comes in plant source foods, where it's not a vitamin, but it does seem to have some positive effects on the body. And vitamin D works really more as a hormone, and it's important for not just our bone mass, which is what a lot of people think of, but it's also very important for muscle function and even nerve functioning. So what are we really talking about here, guys? Well, this would be the basic breakdown of, first and foremost, making sure we're not missing any vitamins or minerals. Vitamin C is important for collagen production. Folate has its own purpose there, as well as pantothenic acid when it comes to collagen. So soft tissue recovery. Obviously, other calcium and otherwise important when it comes to bone formation. We got the outline there for vitamin D. Like anything else, you do need to make sure you're getting enough calories. It's easy for athletes when they're not able to exercise like they once were to go and effectively, cut back on calories, maybe try to lose weight because they're afraid of gaining body fat. But it is really important to make sure that we're keeping them in energy balance. Yeah, you might get a little bit fluffier, but you'll recover faster than if you try starving yourself. So once you get done with doing different types of resistance training or otherwise, that same type of putting in protein directly after it, and then making sure we're getting in appropriate amounts throughout the day. So when we do use those proteins, remember, guys, things that are typically going to be more readily digested is the better way to go about it. And with those protein sources, things that have the complete amino acid profile and are not going to be too hard on the physiology. So what we have here is just another wrap up of those different signaling pathways. Please ask questions. Do you guys feel comfortable? I know I go through the stuff pretty fast. Would you like me to go ahead and talk through any of the signaling pathways a little bit more? Good. That was a good choice. Yeah, well, it's your tissues are remodeling, and it's quite the insult to your body. Well, it's just the injury, not insult, that you have to make sure that you're giving yourself what you need in order to remodel. So AMPK is all about energy availability, and this in turn is going to help us with things like cardiovascular performance. mTOR in its pathway is more heavily related to muscle protein synthesis and catabolism. So when we activate that, it's going to help us more with hypertrophy. And PGC1 alpha is really important when it comes to our body's ability to increase the mitochondrial number inside of those cells because of the energy availability. So it does get signaled on by AMPK. And that in turn is going to help us, now that we have more mitochondria, do a better job of utilizing aerobic metabolism. So no other questions, comments, concerns. We're rolling on to the next little lecture this evening. Anything else you guys want me to go ahead and talk about? Okay, so give me a second, switching the slides around. All right, let's go ahead and talk a bit about body composition in sport. So body weight and body comp are pretty important in their own way in a number of different sports. And like anything else, some athletes are trying to lose weight, some athletes are trying to gain weight. The key is, what's the role in the sport? What's their what do they need to do physically in order to become a better athlete? Obviously, some folks or some sports, it's all about minimizing fat mass. Other sports are all about maximizing lean mass. And then sometimes you're actually doing both. That's exceedingly rare. Now, when it comes to female athletes, you can obviously get pretty low body fats in very specific sports. Now, I really hate how it says higher fat levels of 10 to 20%. 10 to 20% is a pretty damn lean female. But like anything else, it's all about the athlete's performance. So when we're thinking about minimal body composition, a minimum of 5% body fat is important for men in just normal hormone production and health, and about 12% for most athletes. Now, like anything beyond that, when we're looking at the athlete in the sport, it's pretty normal to have body fat percentages that are far higher than that for folks to play well. In fact, obviously, what can you guys think of for sports where you're going to have a much higher body fat percentage as a means to actually make you a better athlete at the sport? What sports are you naturally going to have a much, much higher body fat percentage? Football linemen, sumo wrestlers, super heavyweight lifters, shot putters, throwers. There's a number of sports. Individuals that are power hitters in sports like baseball and softball, we're going to naturally have much higher levels. Now, the rating is the other thing that's just kind of relatively, it's relatively nonsense in that your real risks when it comes to long-term health, it's actually more about your cardiovascular fitness than it is about your body composition. So you can have a higher body weight, much less a higher body fat percentage. As long as you're in good aerobic health, you really are not that much more risky than someone that's of normal, meaning the good considered body composition, who also happens to be in poor aerobic health. Now, body fat percentages for the average, I don't know what population they're working with, but that is massively underestimating, or the methodology they're using is incredibly friendly. The most important thing when we're looking at an athlete, looking at an individual, is that the body composition that we're getting them at is allowing them to perform at the level they're looking for, as well as maintaining the quality of life this individual has. You can always starve yourself down, but that's not a healthy approach. in order to obviously lean somebody out, much less to hopefully enjoy your existence. So it's important when we're working with an individual, figuring out what effective body composition they tend to perform the best at. And now we're talking about, we can have a lower body fat percentage by gaining weight if the only thing we gain is lean mass. So don't be married to a certain body weight. Instead, focus on the outcome. If the athlete's performing better at a higher body fat percentage, let them keep playing there. And then also, does the body composition even matter? Certain sports, body comp doesn't matter at all. Does not make any difference in performance. Now, that's aside from the fact that, remember, golf is not a sport where that body comp doesn't matter, but look at examples from the sport of baseball. You can see examples of it also in sports like football and so on. You can have a very high body fat and be an incredible athlete in that sport. So it's more about making sure the athlete is performing well. So the reason we're going to do this is so we can see how effective is our training program and our dietary approach. So are we gaining lean mass? Or are we losing lean mass? Are we gaining fat weight? Or are we losing fat weight? And if we know this information, we're getting good feedback as to, is our goal of training, or are we being effective? Are we getting things done like we want to? So like anything else, we want to also figure out what's going to be the optimal weight for our athlete to perform at. Now, obviously, there are weight class sports. And if you are weight classed, we need to get you in at a certain body weight. And we typically want you to be as lean as possible at your given weight class so you have an advantage, because fat tissue, unfortunately, isn't helping propel you down the field, isn't helping you overcome your opponent, much less lift a heavier load. So we do also want to figure out and use this as a screening tool to figure out if an athlete is having issues. Now, this is where you need to be very careful. We need to make sure that we're not obsessing on it. We're getting the information. We're not overly sharing it with our athletes. We're making sure that we're using the data to give us informed decisions. So are they adapting appropriately to the program? Is our program too intense? Are they underfueling the program? A lot of different things can go on there. So this is just giving you an idea of different body composition that we might be able to see in different sports. Obviously, some sports are going to be much higher than others. It very much so is pretty wide open. And also notice, guys, this is A, older information, but B, no information on women in the sport of Olympic lifting, which scoreboard, the women's side for Olympic lifting in the US is more successful than the men's side. Just the straight up truth of it. And then obviously women's wrestling is also a sport. Now, when it comes to models, 2-compartment model is we just have 2 different options. It's either all fat, or it's fat mass, or it's fat-free mass. That's it. 3-compartment model is now where the fat-free mass also has bone mass, because bone is denser than lean mass. 4-compartment model is where we have effectively our fat mass, our bone mass, mineral mass, our water weight, and then our protein, kind of the rest of the lean mass component. Now, this can be measured through underwater weighing, which is just using density as a means to figuring out weight, as well as we can do air displacement plethysmography, aka the bod pod, which is the same principle. We're trying to have the density in the underwater weighing tank, but the key is we also don't have to hold ourselves underwater with no air in our lungs. Now, it turns out people's body composition is pretty consistent from one day to the next. You're not going to see major differences, where obviously there was one, but that's probably more of a testing error. Now, a lot of different ways to measure it. Oh, okay, let's do this dance. Now, this is going to be the electrical resistance, where we're going to getting bioelectrical impedance and spectroscopies when you do it over multiple different channels. Computed tomography, this is going to be literally a CT scan where you can use an X-ray and really get into what's going on. Same thing with MRI, magnetic resonance imagery. Now, body mass index is garbage. It is garbage. It is trash. Anyone comes at you and uses that as a marker of health. BMI was invented by a mathematician in the 1800s as a means to try to find normalization for body sizes of a bunch of fucking white people. I'm sorry, I just swore. So it's not useful. In fact, different races naturally have higher BMI, specifically African Americans and Hispanics, whereas other races typically have lower BMIs, and that's typically going to be Asians and Pacific Islanders, except for individuals from I believe it's Somalia, where those folks tend to be much bigger. The key thing is BMI is simply your weight divided by your height, and because he didn't have hardcore computing capabilities, it was supposed to be more like the 2.5 power, but it's easier to do to the second power when you happen to be doing it all by hand. Do not worry about that. Instead, once again, let's focus on looking at real numbers. Waist to circumference or waist to hip ratio can be useful when it comes to adiposity, but if you naturally have really wide hips, you're naturally going to have a potentially wider waist, as well as obviously the hips are wider as well. And that's where you get talking about more like an hourglass figure, which maybe can be useful, but not too much. Densitometry, that's underwater weighing, as well as going to be the air displacement plethysmography. Skin folds is where, we pinch the inch. That gives us at least an idea of what's underneath the skin, doesn't account for visceral fat, and was based on cadavers, and that's not nearly as accurate either. Now, the DEXA dual energy X-ray absorptiometry, which is a great way to go through it because it gives us lean mass, fat mass, and bone mass. That can be a pretty useful means because now we can look at lean mass gain, fat mass gain, lean mass loss, fat mass loss, and bone mineral density gain and loss on a region by region basis. So we can figure out what's going on a little bit better. So the reason we're using densitometry, guys, is the basic assumptions behind it, which is bone is relatively dense, fat is not very dense, and muscle is somewhere in between. That's when they talk about fat floats because it's less than one, muscle sinks because it's more than one. So, like anything else, individuals that happen to have a lower body density are going to also have a higher amount of body fat. Now, when we're looking at how quickly that electricity transfers through your body, that is the resistance. So hence, the resistance is higher whenever oil is involved, aka higher amounts of body fat. And if we do it at different frequencies, that's where we can tell the difference between intra and extra cellular fluid levels as it's going through the body's compartments. But there's some assumptional issues with this because it's based upon going obviously from one wrist to the ankle or going from one leg to the other. We talk about this a little bit in exercise phys, but it's something that if we're doing it consistently, any body compositional method, as long as we're doing it consistently, same people testing, same testing approaches, we can at least see trending information. So yeah, we might not be accurate, but at least we're going to be doing the same thing over and over again. Now, when it comes to doing skin fold calipers, the 3 site for women is going to be triceps, suprailiac, and the mid thigh. Suprailiac should actually be a little bit more off to the side. For gentlemen, it's going to be chest, ab, and thigh, and this should be on the right side of the body. So you had another mistake in your text. As well as notice the Jackson Pollock 4 approach of tricep, subscap, bicep, and suprailiac. Now, this is just kind of with if you have the total skin fold thickness, age of the individual, and give you some information on what effectively we think their body composition is going to be, as well as the BMI table, which once again, when you got to take the trash out, take the trash out. And when we're looking at that waist to hip ratio, we're looking typically at the widest locations. This should probably be a little bit higher. And the waist, we're going to be looking at the narrowest location. Now, obviously, the flaw with the BMI, there's a big damn difference between being a $195 and lean and being a $195 and not so lean. So we really, really want to figure out the body composition. If someone decides to give you trouble because of, once again, your BMI, I've had to have those wonderful conversations with doctors before. Focus again on lean mass, focus again on having good cardiovascular health in general. Now, this is just for the calculation when it comes to, notice guys, the linear regression. So we've got our slope and our intercept of when we're looking at the skin folds, that's going to give us a body density. From there, we would put it through the Siri, the Brozac, or other formulas that are more appropriate for your given ethnicity and age group. And what we do want to utilize is what's known as a multi-component model, which is we want to go ahead and be able to use more than one method, just like we did in the X-Phys lab when you guys came in and did body composition for class, which is it gives us information on the lean mass and fat mass, but it takes it from a number of different angles. And I'll show you in a kind of another slide in a few, where we're looking at essentially different bullseyes, because if we're only using one method, we can naturally have error. If we try to do multiple methods, at least it's going to give us better information as to what effectively the body is going to have. So we're going to make mistakes. No form of body composition measurement is going to be accurate. If anything, certain ones, like depending on the quality of the BIA, is not very accurate. Same thing with skin folds when people don't know what they're doing. But DEXAs do a pretty decent job. Good BIS systems do a good job. Hydrostatic weighing, as long as you're not making mistakes, tends to be pretty accurate, but they're never going to perfectly agree, and they're always going to have error built in. So if we can go and measure multiple ways, we can try to triangulate what body comp is, and then doing the same methodology each time they come in, so we can see how their body shifts. So this is going to be what I mean by effectively those relationships and the bullseye, effectively what we're going to have those individuals going through. If we're doing low accuracy, notice this is just going to be skin fold. So low precision. So we're not accurate and we're shooting all over the place. Now, high accuracy and low precision, meaning we're pretty close to the bullseye, but we're never perfect. That's going to be things like underwater weighing, DEXA, and BOD-POD. Now, you can do things like looking at, essentially, this is going to be looking at doubly labeled water and otherwise levels. Not very accurate, but it's very precise. But what we want is what we have over here. And that is when we're going to be doing those 3 and 4 compartment models, because we're doing total body water and doing extra measurements at the same time. So we get higher accuracy and higher precision. So in a perfect world, that's what we're looking at. Now, what we're going to have you guys do is get into 3 separate groups. Okay. Notice, guys, from the instructions here, I want you guys to, in about, we'll give you 5-10 minutes, let us know what methods would you use for body composition testing. Group 1, you have to test an entire football team. So we're talking 50 plus athletes in 1 hour. Group 2, you have a basketball team, which is usually going to be somewhere between 12 to 16 athletes in 1 hour. And then finally, group 3, you've got 4 athletes recovering from surgery. Same thing, you've got 1 hour. Your budget is going to be relatively unlimited. However, okay, you still have only the 1 hour to do so, and you're only going to have the number of people in your group. So given those constraints, what methodology would you utilize? Now, you're going to have to try to look up and figure out which tests take X amount of time, because that's obviously going to inform what methodology you would approach it with. So any questions, comments, concerns before we put you guys in your first breakout room activity for the evening? All right, guys, have some fun. The rooms are open. It's 6:45 right now. Plan on coming back a few after 6:50, but think about how many different testing methodologies you'd use, and okay, how you're going to be able to navigate all of those athletes in that period of time. What type of information is useful, what you would try and go with. Give us some go. Zoom recording. So for group 3, Colleen, I like what you guys came up with there. The one thing I would add as well is that you could do something like a BIS, something like the SOZO unit that we've got in the lab, or something like an in-body scanner as well, because getting 4 people through there, yeah, DEXAs take somewhere between 7 to 10 minutes, depending on body size. So you can get a lot of really good granular information. And BOD-POD's great, but it doesn't give you a limb by limb, where you can get that from a higher quality BIS system, and obviously from the DEXA as well. So good. Catherine, with your use of the basketball team, doing something like a skinfold BOD-POD, absolutely. Or BOD-POD's going to take a little bit more, like 5 minutes per, but that's going to be something that is feasible, especially if you have like 2 or 3 BOD-PODs. Same thing, if we can increase the number of DEXA scanners, increase the number of SOZOs. So absolutely, that works well. Now, where is my group working with the football team? What are you guys going to do? Not bad, not bad. It takes a little bit more than 3 minutes if they're being optimal. I mean, they're very, very, they're being very optimistic that it would run that fast. But yeah, same thing. You can maybe do skin folds as well. And then same thing with maybe doing a just a simple thing like a Tanita scale or a simple BIS that's going to be able to allow you to enter it pretty quickly ahead of time. But same thing, if you have multiple of those units going at the same time, that's going to really expedite the process. So good work, guys. Any questions over body composition, how we're going to measure it, how we're going to track it, why we care about it before we keep moving on? Because it turns out we actually don't have class at all during Thanksgiving week. So we're doing 3 chapters tonight, and we're doing 3 chapters next week. Any questions, guys? You guys ready to roll? Ready to keep the train rolling? All right. Sounds good. So now let's go ahead and talk about managing that weight. So at the end of the day, first and foremost, remember, guys, body comp, lean mass, it massively depends on the sport, what the individual is doing, and we just want to make sure we're matching that. Now, when it comes to weight management, we're going to go from not just the sports approach, but just kind of the holistic lifestyle approach. So what I have here, guys, is pictures of, these were athletes in the Olympics and otherwise, because there's a couple different pro bodybuilders on for both the male and the female side. I believe this is from the 96 Olympics. So over here is Shane frickin' Hammond. That dude squat over 900 pounds in competition. And he was actually one of the more recent Americans to medal in the clean and jerk. I think he was like I'm pretty sure he was like a 500 pound clean and jerk in competition. So pretty damn impressive. So also that's Cheryl Hainsworth. She was, I think she also medaled in either the snatch or the clean and jerk for the US. So we're just trying to match the sport to what the athlete's doing. Now, at the end of the day, when we are carrying around more body fat than is going to be useful for a given sporting activity, it's not going to probably be helping us out. Now, it does act as padding. It does help protect us. That's why you see football players typically have a higher body fat percentage than other athletes that don't have to deal with all the contact, especially when we're looking at linemen, running backs, linebackers. It, however, is extra weight you have to carry around, which requires more calories to move it. So you're not going to be as fast, you're not going to be as efficient as you would be otherwise. So when we're really talking about peak speed, it's typically why we find very lean individuals at the top, the top of the sport, both for things like long distance and short distance athletic events. Now, a big component of effectively how much body fat we have is just straight up genetics. Now, not just our natural propensity for it, but also where we store it. Because there's some folks that store it incredibly well. There's some folks that do not store it as well. And once again, this is going to be a genetic thing. We talked about how we get a little bit of changes when we go into a higher or lower calorie diet, how the body is naturally going to up and down regulate things like a resting metabolic rate. This is where some folks are going to have a much more robust, essentially, resistance from the body when it comes to both trying to gain and lose weight. So same thing we're going to find when it comes to looking at things like visceral fat. So remember, that's the type of fat that's wrapped around our internal organs. So inside of our abdominal cavity, wrapped around our intestines, so forth, which can be rough because it's kind of choking the body out. Now, what we have here, guys, is effectively how much food individuals would eat, okay? Both the weight of the food on the left and then the total energy intake, and then essentially the percentage of the diet being coming from fat. And notice, guys, fat is very calorically dense. So when you happen to have anybody eating usually more calorically dense food, they typically are going to take in more calories in a given day. Now, we do a pretty decent job of regulating our calorie intake to the amount of exercise we do. It's when we're sedentary that we have a complete dysregulation of this relationship. And when we're going into massively high amounts, we're going to typically undereat our amount of physical activity. So that being said, we want to make sure that, yeah, we're being physically active and we're getting into massively large volumes. If that's something we're doing because we're in the military and just what's required of us, just understanding we're going to hemorrhage some weight. But if we're getting into unhealthy relationships with exercise, we need to be a little bit more careful. Now, when it comes to the regulation of appetite, this is going to be something that's going on in the brain thanks to a lot of different inputs, okay? The hypothalamus, specifically the arcuate nucleus, which is going to be getting information from our nervous system, from our metabolic system, and then also endocrine systems or signals, which in turn is telling us to take in more calories when we do things like a lot of physical activity, or take in less calories when we're not being physically active. So this is going to help us with regulating not just energy intake, but also the energy expenditure. And this is why we can see that suppression of things like our thyroid hormones, and hence eventually our resting metabolic rate, more so than just the loss of lean mass we're having with weight change. So we need to make sure that we're taking in an adequate amount of calories, and just keeping in mind that we've got some signaling going on. So when it comes to external factors, we have got the joys of being social engagements. What is coming up to you guys, for everybody, in theory, in 2 weeks? What are you guys hopefully going to be going and doing? Yes, Thanksgiving, where you get to go back, tolerate your family, maybe drink your way through it, maybe avoid them. Your own personal choice. You guys do what you want to do. Where we celebrate a holiday about how the Native Americans did the original Europeans coming over here a solid. And then those Europeans subjugated them, gave them polio blankets, and a lot of other things that aren't really happy things to think about, but try not to think about that. Now, what activities in your guys' life is not essentially social activities involving either food or drink? What are things that you come together with a lot of other people that doesn't involve a lot of food or drink? Yes, sports. Now, what do people typically do while they're watching those sports, Colleen? You're right. They get together and play sports. Absolutely. This is America. Most Americans like to watch. They don't like to play anymore. So that's what we're talking about. We're going to go tailgate. You know, they put down a couple thousand calories of beer and pizza and chicken wings and everything else. You're right. They can also go to churches. And what's one of the best nutritional not best nutritional things? What can be one of the easy nutritional things to have after service on a Sunday morning? How many folks had the experience of, well, I mean, it depends on how hard you go into the wine, but this could be something like, I know from my experience, otherwise, it's going to be things like donuts and otherwise. And then also, what do you also find around Lent? You can find fish fries and otherwise. Now, you're right. It's not the only thing going on, but that's just kind of give you guys some examples. Now, when it says palatability, what are we talking about when we're talking about food? What's palatability? Yeah, how much we enjoy it. Okay, exactly. If you don't enjoy it, you tend to not eat as much. If you really enjoy it, you tend to eat more. So my wife's got her headphones on, so she can't hear me right now. But if she could, I'd have her come over and we'll have a conversation about, turns out her palatability has changed pretty heavily as she's gone through, obviously, her chemotherapy. And so when she does find foods that she enjoys, we buy more of it simply because it's something she's going to actually eat. Now, when we talk about habits with food, this is going to be like, I'm someone that always eats breakfast, or I always eat a snack, or I make sure that I always eat something before I go to bed. Work itself, obviously, lunch breaks or lack of lunch break, stress itself. How many of you guys know when you're stressed, you don't eat? And then how many of you guys do the opposite? When you're stressed, you feel like Garfield and you can never stop eating enough. Yeah. And then the other side of it, guys, when it comes to exercise, how many guys get done working out and you have no interest in eating for a couple hours? And then how many guys are the opposite? You finish eating and you're like, I'm ready to go smash a Chinese buffet. And these are all different effects of the regulation. Now, ghrelin is going to be the signaling hormone. Nice. That we get from our stomach. We're getting a little bit of signaling from our liver from different hormones. So cholecystokinin, GLP-1, PYY, we'll get into the names in a little bit, coming from our digestive system, as well as we have leptin, which is coming from our adipose, of letting them know essentially how well topped off the fat cells are. And it turns out when they're not that topped off, we're going to be being told to eat more and more. So all of these signals are going to give us the overall appetite. So go figure, we have higher amounts of ghrelin, okay, before we eat. And then once we get done eating, we're going to have lower ghrelin levels until once again, we have that natural response again. Now, when it comes to the gut itself, cholecystokinin, CCK, glucagon-like peptide, GLP-1, and then peptide YY, all these are related to not just the amount of calories we're taking in, but also the macronutrient breakdown. Is there a lot of carbs, fats, and proteins? And that's why fats and proteins are pretty highly satiety or satiating, whereas carbohydrates, in specific type of carbohydrates, are actually going to give us more satiety signal or less. So notice ghrelin is the only one that's telling us eat more. The rest are telling us you've had enough, time to calm down. Now, go figure, we're not going to eat all at once and then forget for a while. We tend to eat relatively frequently, okay? Now, in theory, we are eating when we're hungry, but as being humans and being socialized, a lot of folks no longer eat based upon hunger satiety signals. Instead, like I eat breakfast, I eat lunch, I eat dinner. When folks are trying to gain weight, they might be stuffing themselves and they're never really hungry, which can be uncomfortable. And then on the other side, folks, when they're trying to lose weight, they might feel like they're starving all the time and they're never really that hungry. Or they're always hungry. They're never that satiated. So satiation is literally referring to at the end of the meal, you hopefully aren't feeling uncomfortably full, but you know you've had enough inside of you. It's time to go and take a break. And that's the end of that meal. Now, go figure, different macronutrients, different effects here. Protein actually is one of the highest satiating factors. So high protein diet typically is going to help individuals take in less calories, whereas greater amounts of fat can have a little bit more than carbohydrates, but not as much. Now, when it comes to per calorie ingested, that means like how much you're taking in. Yes, fats give you more on a gram per gram, so weight per weight, you have a higher satiety, but a calorie per calorie, because remember, fats are naturally more dense, they actually don't give you as much of a satiety signal. Now, when it comes to exercise itself, when we do short, medium term exercise, so we're talking about 10, 20, or half an hour, hour or two, we are going to typically create a little negative balance, energy balance in the first about 2 weeks. Now, after that, we're going to start to catch up, meaning now we're going to eat more so that we're going to effectively maintain our total amount of body weight. And so if we want to keep losing weight from sheerly just the exercise, because people tend to what's known as out eat their training, we've got to do a whole lot of work. So the compensation you get is rarely ever going to be perfect. So hence a higher volume of work is sometimes what's necessary if folks are trying to weight control. And then ask yourself, why are we even trying to weight control? Is this something that's going to really help them out? Or is this something that we're doing for just sheerly aesthetic reasons? Now, with Eric coming last week, talking a little bit about nutrition otherwise, what we have is what's known as the additive and constrained energy models. Now, some folks like to think of it as additive. So I do physical activity, but the rest of my energy expenditure, the rest of my metabolic rate, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, thermic effect food stays the same. So yeah, I burn more calories. What's really happening is more of this what's constrained. So as we increase physical activity more and more, we're going to start to see a down regulation of potentially resting metabolic rate and definitely the non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So our total calories burned each day is not going to be as much. Now notice guys in the bottom right, that's further putting home the amount of physical activity you're doing, and then in turn, the actual amount of calorie intake. So individuals that are very low, so pretty sedentary, they in turn are relatively, that's why it says non-regulated. So it means they're dysregulated. They're not getting that signaling in their body of like, I've had enough or I haven't had enough. Now, as we increase our exercise volume, that's when we tend to have a better effect of stabilizing our body weight and maintaining within certain ranges, because our body is getting that feedback from not just the food you're taking in, but obviously the hormonal milieu, which is letting us know when we've had enough and when we haven't had enough in the first place. So when it comes to exercise compared to diet for weight loss, both methods work. The key is what is going to be sustainable for the individual and what are the outcomes we're looking for. So we just got done talking about body comp. If you're trying to do all of your weight loss through dieting, congratulations, you're going to be losing a lot of lean mass and fat mass. If you're going to try to do your weight loss through exercise, congratulations, you're going to maintain your lean mass, potentially increase it, as well as decreasing your fat mass. Now, the key is no matter what, all we need to create is a negative energy balance. That's it. Now, we can do this through either less calories in or more calories out. Quite simple. But the key is what is going to keep somebody going for longer? What are they going to be able to maintain for the long haul? So When it comes to the energy deficit you might get from things like skipping a breakfast, that, yeah, you've got less calories in it, but now we're going to have more effects of hunger as we go throughout the day for some individuals, which in turn, when we get to food cravings, congratulations, diet plans work. The actual, like, if you follow them to the letter, if you were stuck in a prison cell and you had to follow the diet, it would work every damn time. The reality is we're free living humans. We're going to make choices, and sometimes those choices are going to be detrimental. And especially when you're having all that signaling telling you to eat more, that you're hungry, it's really hard for folks to say no and be like, I should probably push the plate away. So, like anything else, we do need to make sure when we're working with individuals, we figure out what's going to be more sustainable. Typically an approach of both. Both we're improving our nutritional habits in ways that are going to give us potentially a little bit lower calorie intake, but we also are going to be making sure that we're moving more throughout the day. So we're getting better satiety signaling, as well as we're going to be creating that deficit. So if we're really talking about keeping off for the long term, because remember now, guys, we've got a lower body weight, which in turn typically means we've got a lower resting metabolic rate, we're going to have to effectively have dietary restriction if we want to maintain it. It's the brutal reality of it. It's the reason why over 95% of nutritional interventions fail over the long haul. Adherence. People fall off the wagon. So a lot of different ways that we can go about it. Let's go ahead and just run through this lightning round. When it comes to energy restriction, go figure. Lower calories in, typically lose weight, something that can be a little bit more easy to maintain. Reduced fat intake can work, but then of course, if we just subsist that or replace that with a greater amount of carbohydrate, turns out, yeah, it can help us lose weight, but that's a little bit harder for folks to sometimes maintain over the long haul. Low energy diets, so we're talking about the straight up starving, it's like HCG diet and other nonsense. Go figure. You starve yourself, you lose weight, but that doesn't mean it's going to be sustainable. And that's when it's really hard for people to, once they finish, they go back to the previous eating behaviors and they go right back up to where they were at before. If not, they can overshoot it. So we want to, once again, focus on the healthy individual. Just be healthy. Be in good aerobic condition, be in whatever strength level you want, have the mobility to do the things you like to do, and then move on. If you want a certain aesthetic, that's fine. But then keep in mind the cost of that aesthetic, not just getting there, but staying there every single day. Now, low-fat diets can work for some individuals, depending on how well they prefer carbohydrate intake, as well as taking in lower or better carbohydrate sources. So just because we're low fat doesn't mean we're going to just be pounding down pixie sticks and candy like it matters. Food combining diet is one of the wildest, insane things that ever has come across, where the idea is if we eat this food with this food, we're going to lose weight. And it's straight up nonsense. But that is some of the things, like some folks, like if you only eat grapefruit for breakfast, you'll lose weight. Well, it's just cool. And if you only eat celery over a single damn meal, you lose weight. High protein diets do work because it helps with satiety signaling, but obviously not everybody likes high protein diet. It can be hard on some people's GIs, and not to mention the potential constipation effects if you're getting into folks that like to do the carnivore diet these days, where they just go hard on the protein and have nothing else. But if you're the type of person that you're really all or none and you can adhere to it, there might be some way to go about it. The zone diet was popularized years ago, where you're doing essentially 33% protein, same, 1/3 protein, 1/3 fat, 1/3 carbs. It's just another approach, but it's typically kind of like a Mediterranean diet, where you're also trying to do a lot of healthy complex carbohydrates, healthier fat sources, lean protein sources, etc. Low carb diets, now we're getting into potentially things like the ketogenic diet. That can work for some people, because go figure, you can now go ahead and decrease your intake a little bit, and go figure, if you kind of at some point you've had enough bacon and fat for the day, you don't really feel like having more. Now, manipulation of energy density, this is going to be volumetric, so we can eat a lot of vegetables. We can have a lot of bulk of food, and that's going to help with kind of that ghrelin a little bit, because we're stretching out the stomach, but we're not getting in as many calories, and this can be a way that works. Now, obviously, some folks are going to do manipulations of things like adding or removing like low-fat dairy as a way. Obviously, there's a lot of issues with folks getting, there's folks that have concerns about using non-nutritive sweeteners on negative effects on their health. Some folks don't respond well to those. They get headaches, and that's fine. Don't do it. Other folks can tolerate them as well. If that's something that replaces, instead of doing 200 to 500 calories a day in soda, they're now doing 0 because they're doing diet soda. It's a win. Take the win. Vegan diets is potentially another way that we can go ahead and lose weight. And I think, was it Maddie that we were talking this week about the joys of doing a vegan diet and how that might help improve somebody's overall nutrition? Did you and I speak about that? Okay, so one of the big key things when you go to any of these type of diets is how sometimes when you remove things from the diet, it's addition through subtraction. Meaning, if you're on a vegan diet, okay, yes, you're only eating plants, you're not doing anything that's the product of an animal or came from the animal. When you do that diet, what foods are no longer on the menu? What can you not eat if you're on a vegan diet? Think about things that you're probably gonna be healthier because you're not doing them anymore. What's out? Yeah, but now think about things that people really enjoy that aren't exactly Colleen. There goes chicken nuggets, chicken fingers, chicken fried steak. Like every single fried food. Eggs aren't so bad for you, Tyler, but you're right. That is going to be a source of fat and protein. But a number of folks, when they do these diets, like, oh my God, I feel so much better because I switched over to this diet. It's like, you probably feel better because you're not doing this crap anymore because we remove those certain components from the diet. You know, it turns out it's pretty hard to get trans fat in your diet if you're eating a vegan diet. I'm sure you can do it. But yeah, there goes the easy dessert option. There goes cookies, there goes ice creams. Yes, I'm sure there's vegan versions of them. My immediate assumption is they're probably kind of sad. But that being said, you know, eat in accordance to your own, not just nutritional needs, but also what you are comfortable with when it comes to kind of living deliberately and the philosophical reasons why folks choose to be vegan. I can respect that to no end. So one thing to keep in mind when it comes to a calorie in, calorie out, not all calories are the same. First and foremost, we've talked about the different metabolic pathways of how we're going to break down those calories, and then also how they're going to influence different hormones. So essentially, the calories we have in our food are not going to all have the same effect on satiety signaling, as well as obviously the effects on building different tissues and so forth. So yes, we do need to make sure that we're getting enough calories, but by making slightly different food selections, this can make it easier to adhere to calorie restrictions. So for example, protein's inefficient. Adding in protein to the diet is typically, when we're also subtracting carbohydrates, subtracting fats, we're going to effectively fill in more space when it comes to adherence and feeling full, more so than if we just took protein back and increased the carbs instead. In fact, that's one of the best ways to gain weight, is just increase carbohydrates. Now, also, when it comes to sugars, simple sugars are going to be metabolized pretty quickly. And what's fascinating is, notice there, guys, fructose, which is going to be high fructose corn syrup and otherwise, it happens to actually not have as great of effect on ghrelin. So you're not going to have as much satiety signaling, hence why folks can drink a lot of soda and, go figure, still be really hungry. Now, refined carbohydrates, because they digest far faster, you get that insulin and blood sugar spike, and then you come back down far more rapidly. So you're typically going to be more prone to eating more frequently, which is fine. If you're trying to gain weight, refined carbohydrates is a good way to go about it. But if you're trying to control your body weight, that's where complex carbohydrates, adding things like fiber, it's going to slow down digestive rate, and protein as well, is going to help us feel fuller for longer. So when you're thinking about things that have high satiety, so you're definitely going to have it. Notice, guys, what do you have in common? You've got protein, you have fiber, and you're going to have potentially a lot of nutrients. Then on the other side, we've got things that are pretty simple carbohydrates, simple sugars, rapidly going to break down pretty quickly. So essentially, some of the low carb diets are going to work just simply because you're not taking as many carbs and you're replacing them with, in some cases, more protein. And like anything else, once we know how we respond, what food can you guys eat, and then 1 hour later, you're ready to eat some more? And then what foods can you eat once, and then you don't want to eat that for at least another 4 or 5 hours? Now, not because it's not palatable, but because it gives you that much of a satiety effect. So I'm sure you guys have had some type of food that's very high protein, very high fat, and otherwise, and you're like, I'm good, I don't need to touch anything for a while. Meanwhile, obviously, that's the cake and ice cream thing. You can do that and then be like, I could probably go for another slice of cake. But typically, people don't say the same thing about like plain chicken. It's like, I think I'm good. I've kind of put in as much as I want for the day. So, heck yeah, Tyler, I like where you're at. When it comes to our decreasing resting metabolic rate as we lose weight, remember, first and foremost, we need to be in this negative balance. But as that resting metabolic rate comes down, we need to either decrease our calorie intake even more or increase our overall total amount of physical activity. Because, go figure, we need to still be running at the deficit. So as we lose weight, we become more efficient. And as we're more efficient, we're not burning as many calories. We're not burning as many calories. It's far harder to maintain those changes. So if you guys look at the image on the right, you see the effects both of weight loss and weight gain. As we gain weight, so does our resting metabolic rate increase, and actually tends to increase more so than the amount of energy expenditure loss we're going to have with losses in body mass. Now, when people constantly go up and down in weight, and sometimes yo-yo dieting otherwise, we refer to that as weight cycling. So we go and we lose the weight and we regain it. Typically, it's going to come back on very quickly. Now, if you're a bodybuilder and your goal is in fact to increase lean mass, hold for a while, decrease fat mass, that's fine. That is actually part of that sport. That's part of that activity. But for most folks just trying to be healthy, living their life, that is a very suboptimal approach. So when we're thinking about weight cycling, we want to usually spend about 1 to 3 months deliberately trying to gain weight or deliberately trying to lose weight, because we find that plateau potential. So the longer we do something, the slower our rate of change, the harder it is to make further progress. Now, there's some folks that will try to bulk for about 1 to 3 months, maintain that new body composition, maybe do a mini cut, something that's like only about a week or maybe 1 or 2 weeks of lower calories, and then try to bulk again. Same thing when it comes to weight loss. But we want to maintain this new body weight for a certain period of time. That way we're physiologically more prepared or more comfortable with holding that weight for a while. Now, on the right side here, guys, you see the total energy intake and the energy density of the diet. So notice the higher energy density food group took in more calories than the lower energy density group. It's the equivalent of if the only thing you could eat all day was effectively, we'll say healthy options. So it's going to be things like nuts and meat. And then the other option is just nothing but salads. You got to eat a hell of a lot of salad in order to have that same total amount of caloric intake. And notice, guys, again, the signaling that we're getting from ghrelin and how when we go through greater amounts of different types of macronutrients, it in turn is going to give us those better satiety signals. So when we want to gain weight, we want to be in a positive energy balance. And typically, without really adding in too much fat, if you're going to do it, monounsaturated are absolutely the best choice to go with. And so we really want to do it through pushing carbohydrates, not protein. Protein, A, because it'll give us a satiety effect. And really, protein isn't as important when you're trying to gain weight. It's more important as far as higher protein intake relative to your body size when you happen to be trying to lose weight and maintain your lean mass as you do so. So go figure, if we're trying to build muscle mass, we want to do both a higher protein intake, kind of talked about what that means, as well as we want to be doing, obviously, resistance training. And keep in mind, the rate of which you gain weight, just like the rate of which you lose weight, the faster you try to lose it, the more likely you're going to be losing a greater percentage of lean mass, which is probably not what you're going for. And then the vice versa. The more aggressive you are with the bulking, like the dirty bulk, the more you are going to be adding on fat mass, not lean mass. So we want to make sure when we're working with our athletes, when we're working with anyone, we're making realistic goals. And specifically, we're probably only trying to gain at most a pound. I mean, if you got a young guy that's really kind of finding out resistance training, everything for the first time, might be like a pound a week. Most likely we're only going to talk about like half a pound a week. And then when we're talking about weight loss, about the same. You can also think of percentages. When we're talking about weight loss, we're talking about only 0.5% of body weight a week, because that's something that you can maintain as sustainable. Now, your first week, because of glycogen levels being lower, body weight, water fluid level being lower, you're going to have faster loss the first week. But after that, trying to have something that we're going to be able to maintain that's sustainable. And then we get to that new weight. Remember, folks, we're going to still be on a lower caloric intake typically than we were when we first started. And we have to make peace with that, or we have to be comfortable with it. Now, I'm sure you guys have heard of intermittent fasting. It's something that's kind of becoming a little bit more popular these days. The idea that you would do essentially one day or more where you take in incredibly low amounts of calories might have potentially positive effects on autophagy, meaning essentially cellular housekeeping and cleaning, decreasing things like cancer risks and improving overall health. Now there's whereas where folks will alternate, so they'll have one day where they eat normally, one day where they don't eat at all. Some folks will do the low calorie, so it's only the 500 to 600 calories per day, as opposed to the normal amount of calories they take in. That's like a fasting mimicking diet. Gosh, who's it? Sasha Pandon, something like that. He's done a lot of the research there where that might have positive effects on increasing longevity and otherwise. Yeah, lab rats live longer if they're starved. That doesn't mean that's how you want to live as a human. As well as then there's some folks that do, 5 days of normal eating and then 2 days a week, sometimes over the weekend, sometimes on the weekdays, they're going to decrease it. This is something that's still being researched very heavily. It's definitely not where we can give you straight up, this is the way you need to go. Some folks will do essentially, they have only windows where they fast for 16 hours and then eat for only 8 of them each day. There's nothing wrong with doing that if you happen to be an individual that it works well for, but we have to think about what's our goal. If our goal is increasing or maximizing lean mass, this is not an optimal strategy. If your goal is to do this for health and it agrees with you, then you know what, go for it. The key, again, and I know I've said it before in this class, is what people find to be effective when it comes to the nutritional interventions, they tend to become evangelical about, meaning this worked for me, so it'll work for everyone. No, our physiologies, though very similar, do have differences, as well as when it comes to individuals, the way folks live. Now, the warrior diet, this is awesome, in that you literally just eat only one big meal a day. Yeah, you can have little fruit and vegetables throughout the day because it'd be grazing, but the idea is at night you would feast. Well, humans also would starve a lot, and they also died of a lot of simple diseases at younger ages. So just because there's some interest in kind of fat approaches, I wouldn't try any of these things, and much less feel like you're a failure if they didn't work for you. The key is you've got to find something that's sustainable, something you can maintain for the long haul. Now, when it comes to really comparing low carb versus low fat diets, like anything else, it's not really going to be typically a great approach. And Hall is one of like the biggest name researchers, worked for the NIH for long-term weight loss, just for the simple reality of, we were talking about the caloric density. Now, that being said, some folks will once again tell you ketogenic diet is the way to live and it helped fix all their problems in life. The key thing is you need to figure out what works for you and what is sustainable. Okay. Now, what they do find is, go figure, individuals that are doing the low fat diet typically are going to be burning a little bit more calories, maybe feeling a little bit better, have a bit more energy than individuals on the low fat diet. So overall, notice guys, it was pretty rare that there was better changes or better progress for folks in the low fat group. So kind of, again, touching on this briefly of the different approaches, the different potential weight loss. I mean, think about it, guys. You're starving yourself so you lose weight super fast. Okay. Whereas, you can do low fat, it's gonna be a little bit more sustainable, just doing that about a pound per week. And that's going to be based upon, trying to think of the size of an individual, probably something that's at least 160, 170 pounds. We just want to make sure we're giving folks realistic expectations. Now, when it comes to gender differences with weight loss, your average female obviously doesn't have the same testosterone level as your average male. So you've got that difference. You've got your average female is going to be far smaller than your average male. So they typically burn less calories per day than your average guy. Guys, is because we're larger in body size and body weight, on average, are going to be able to lose weight at a little bit faster rate. And then when it comes to health, and it should be, are we doing it for health or are we doing it for performance? So when we're really doing major energy deficits in females, we can be talking about risks of at least oligoria, if not getting into amenorrhea, which turns out is not a good sign because that means we're underfueling the body. And so we want to make sure we're making sustainable changes at rates that once again are going to be appropriate. So your average female, the weight loss rate is going to be lower than your average male. And when we start to have issues with normal hormonal cycling, overall energy, feelings of well-being, that's when we want to be a bit more careful with obviously the rate at which we're acting for them to go. So how are we gonna do this? First and foremost, set appropriate goals. I'm banging on the table for a reason. One of the coaches that used to work at Eastern, you guys mind if I swear for a second? I'm gonna pause for a second before I hit this rant. Or you got, actually, you know, and if you guys don't want me to rant, I just want to go into it. Set appropriate. Somebody said yes, we're going for it. So the ones that didn't show up tonight missed that. That's too bad. You know, we had a good conversation. It was a very kind, gentle conversation about some of the intricacies of working with coaches and helping them understand the mistakes of their way. So when you're working with folks, effectively, how much weight can we get somebody to put on in 1 month? Well, oh gosh, I mean, I would say maybe somewhere in the neck of as low as 2, if we're talking about a much smaller, you know, small, both vertically and framed athlete in a month of, you know, good tissue, to maybe if we got a really big, you know, offensive lineman, we might be able to do something more in the neck of, you know, getting close to 6, maybe even 9 pounds. But the faster we go, guys, the more we're going to be adding fat mass that's not helping them. And then obviously the other side is going to be true. If we're going over that 0.5%, 1% per week, we're going to start hemorrhaging lean mass, and that's not going to help people out. So when you're working with your athletes, let's say, for example, I picked on Jake way too much today in biomechanics and otherwise. Who should I pick on? Okay, so actually, yeah. Maddie, you came by the lab. Obviously, she plays for the volleyball team here. Let's say when you go back home, you decide to do the sport that, no offense, most people think of when you think of high caliber athletes from New Zealand. And what sport is that?
Rugby.
Damn straight. So we try to, is the females team also the All Blacks?
I think they're the Black Ferns, maybe.
Well, yeah, either way, we're going to try to get her to play rugby, and we want her to be a front row because you're tall, but you're nowhere near heavy enough. So if we're going to try to get Maddie, when she's done playing volleyball and she's planning on playing beach in the spring, we're going to say we're going to try to get her to be where she can be a prop, maybe a lock. And so we probably want to get, the big goal would maybe be something like 30, 40 pounds. We're not going to do that in one off season. We're going to maybe try to put on something like maybe 10 pounds if we can do it and it's going well, and then have her play at that weight for 1 season. And then the next off season, we try to put on another 10 pounds and so on and so forth. So we're going to make sure we find an approach that's appropriate. And so the same thing, when we get folks and we're trying to get them to lose weight, let's go ahead and figure out, okay, how much weight do we have to lose? So could be in some cases over 100 pounds. Okay, well, if we're just trying to lose 1 pound a week, we're talking about 2 years of work. And that's not saying we don't take a break on occasion and just try to maintain the new weight, or maybe even try to gain a little bit of weight back just to have a real good mental reset. And so we want to make sure that we're doing a little energy restriction. We're still making sure we're getting enough carbohydrates and protein so we can keep our performance up, and then getting in essentially the more minimal amount of fat so we can maintain overall hormonal health and still get folks to recover. So when you're working with athletes, when you're working with anyone in general, making sure we first and foremost start off with appropriate goals. What's a rate that's going to really work and be sustainable? And so when we're talking about exercising for fat loss, the big key we want to go ahead and do is just simply have them exercise at a relatively low intensity for a long enough period of time so we're going to be burning through those calories. So like anything else, the most important thing is just total calories out. If we get that total calories out at a higher rate, the weight loss goes faster. So if that's because we did more exercise, perfect. If it's because we took in less calories, fine. Just remembering there's pros and cons to both approaches. And then also keeping in mind that we can't just keep increasing exercise volume as a means to lose weight, because it turns out you only have so many hours in the day. Folks have got different things they need to do. We can't just keep increasing total exercise volume because go figure, you literally do have a life you have to live. And remember, as we lose weight, we don't burn as many calories per mile per a given distance. So we have to go a little bit faster. So when it comes to, we have our strategy. Common mistakes is obviously going too fast and then even potentially going too slow. We want to make sure we're going at a consistent rate. We're checking in on a weekly basis and we're seeing how things obviously change. Keep in mind, when we're working with athletes, specifically when we're working with female athletes, depending on where we're at in the cycle, we can have fluid retention, and that's going to throw off our numbers. So we're just trying to follow that average body weight and see where it's trending. So we might want to take it typically at least a couple times a week so you can see where folks are going. Now, there are things we can do in order to make weight. Usually this is going to be things like water manipulation, lower glycogen levels, so that we're going to go ahead and make weight. Some folks are going to use things like laxatives. Some folks are going to use diuretics, things like Lasix and otherwise. Don't play around with those if you guys can help it. They're going to be hard on your body. If you guys are interested in water manipulation to make weight for things like powerlifting competitions, otherwise, I've done it many a time. It's something that I can go ahead and talk you guys through, but that's not something I feel comfortable recording and putting up there, just because it can easily be potentially dangerous. This is where you get into like wrestlers in sauna suits running in heated stairwells until one of them blacks out and potentially dies. So we want to make sure that we're being smart and safe whenever we're trying to do any of those type of more rapid weight loss strategies. So from there, when it comes to weight gain, once again, setting appropriate goals. So if we're trying to gain just lean mass, that's that ½ pound a week, maybe more, maybe less, depending on training age, body size, and everything else. And then as we go further and further into training, the bulking rates, we're going to be naturally getting more fat mass than lean mass. So at a certain point, we want to stop, maintain this new body mass, maybe once again, do that mini cut to try to lose a little bit of body fat, and then go into it again. So there's a lot of different potential ways to go about it. The key is we need to figure out what's going to be sustainable. Now, the last thing we're going to have you guys do is working in your groups. And you guys have obviously these different athletes. Your goal is to, in 1 calendar year, okay, get them to get up to, in Simone Biles' case, 300 pounds. We use DK Metcalf, but you guys can pick another essentially large NFL football player otherwise. And then obviously the swimmer, Michael Phelps, you've got 1 year to bulk him up to 400 pounds. So given what you'd expect their current activity levels to be, given obviously you can look at their height, weight, age, etc., and enter that into the formula here and then share it back and forth with the group, figure out how many calories would that be they take in each day, and then give us a representative diet of effectively what you'd have them take in on a given day. So say we're just going to Homer Simpson and do it every single time so that you're going to get them up to that body size. It's currently 740 right now. We're going to go ahead and put you guys into those breakout rooms in just a moment. And you guys, let's give you pretty close to 750 because it's going to take a little bit. But give us an idea of like the sheer volume of food, calories, and everything else we're going to have to do to get ourselves up to that type of body size. So whenever you guys are ready, go and hop on in. I'll see you guys back at about 7:50.